Not much backstory is required, but the basic facts are crucial to understanding what happened after the defining event. I'm Grant Oster. When I was in graduate school getting my master's degree in chemistry, I met Laura. I fell in love immediately. I think it took her 6 months just before she got her master's in art history, before she fell in love with me. But it happened. I don't think either of us was particularly experienced, though. As far as I could tell, our sex life was excellent, and she never voiced any complaints. We married less than a year after she got her master's degree and got jobs in the same town. She taught at a community college, and I taught part-time at a state university. I also worked part-time at a scientific consulting firm. After 3 years of marriage, I resigned from the university and worked full-time as a consultant. I became an explosives expert, and one of the clients I worked for was the federal government. Around the time our first daughter, Angela, was born, I was doing most of my work for the government, and it required quite a bit of traveling. I know it was hard on Laura, but I did offer to quit and take a full-time teaching job at a community college that tried to hire me many times. However, Laura loved the money my job brought in and the lifestyle it allowed us. She encouraged me to stick with it. "I can survive. I'm self-sufficient," was her smiling mantra. My traveling hadn't loosened up too much by the time our second daughter, Grace, was born, 2 years after Angela was born. I again suggested a career change, but Laura again insisted that I continue as a counselor since we now had an extra mouth to feed, clothe, and educate. When the girls were 5 and 7, my schedule changed for a while, and with my help with childcare and after the girls went to school, Laura decided to go back to work. She took an administrative job at a local university, mostly working on the liberal arts college. For reasons I never really understood, but which I didn't care about because it made her happy, Laura developed a keen interest in photography. We have over a dozen albums of our life with our children. Another seemingly strange interest that Laura developed at that time was in other languages, most notably Italian. Now there were times when Laura traveled for her work, especially to Chicago, where she had meetings with benefactors, visiting professors, and the Art Institute, as well as visits with Gina, her college friend who was an exchange student from Italy at the time but now worked in Chicago. When the children were 8 and 10, terrorist activities around the world made my skills extremely valuable to the federal government, and I was hired to work for them full-time for 2 years. I had discussed this with Laura for many hours before agreeing to the assignment because it would lead to a lot more traveling during those 2 years, or possibly longer, and sometimes I would be gone for more than a month at a time. Laura cheered me up by telling me that she and the girls would miss me, but it would be okay. Because of my job with the federal government, I was absent 2 Christmases in a row when Grace was 9 and 10 and Angela was 11 and 12, which was heartbreaking. Laura took the girls to visit Gina in Chicago. I talked to them on the phone every day during their week-long visit, and they seemed happy enough. Apparently, there were some of Gina's relatives visiting. Some of them the girls had met before, and some were kids about the age of our daughters. Finally, shortly before Thanksgiving, after being on assignment for over 2 years providing my expertise to combat terrorists, I returned to consulting full-time and rarely traveled. Laura continued to travel from time to time, usually about once a month for 2 or 3 days, mostly to Chicago, and I was happy to take over all parenting duties for Grace and Angela when she was away, although sometimes they traveled with her. I think it is to be expected that girls grow closer to their mother than to their father. Although I had a good relationship with Grace and Angela, they never really shared important things with me, and they rarely asked my opinion on personal matters, although they always seemed to share personal information with Laura. It didn't really bother me much, except for one thing. They were never, ever, ever as talkative as they usually were when talking about their experiences when they went to Chicago with their mother. Although they were not closed-minded about it, they never shared information willingly and often changed the subject with a laugh. Shortly before 18-year-old Grace started college out of state, while Angela was a freshman at another out-of-state college at the time, Laura was going through a dark period. When I caught her crying a few times, I asked her what was wrong. She wrote it off as her becoming lonely. She said she needed to go shopping with the girls in Chicago. They don't have stores in Columbus. The trip was planned in a hurry and apparently required several long phone conversations with Gina, in Italian. Since I didn't understand Italian, I just accepted what Laura told me about the details. I had no reason to doubt her, although she had never before been so tearful as she had been 3 or 4 days before she and the girls went to Chicago. Laura returned from Chicago 3 days later more optimistic, though still not quite normal. That wasn't what was surprising, however. What was surprising were the few purchases the three of them returned from their shopping trip with. When I asked about it, I was told that some items would be shipped later, including some directly to the girls' college addresses. I did notice that my sex life, which had never been bad except, of course, when I was away for long periods of time because I never cheated on Laura, had gotten better once Grace left for school. I attributed it to the fact that Laura and I had bonded as empty nest people, and I really liked that it started happening more often. Then a defining event in my story happened. One Thursday, I skipped work around noon without telling Laura, who was at her usual place of employment. I had planned to play 9 holes of golf, but the rain negated those expectations. I did, however, plan for our upcoming anniversary. I wanted to throw Laura a surprise party, so I talked to an event planner and got down to business. Around 3 p.m., a delivery man came to the door with a wooden box labeled Fragile, which he carried up the 4 front steps of our house on a dolly. The package was addressed to Laura. I signed for it, and with the courier's help, we placed it in the living room in a stable position, properly positioned this side up. I thought the delivery of the box was strange. I couldn't imagine what was in it. I looked at the return address, and it said Romano's Photography Studio, followed by an address in Chicago, which I knew was downtown. I called Laura at work and told her about the arrival of the box. She was silent at first. Then she said, "Oh, it's work-related. They were supposed to send it to my office. I think they made a mistake. Just leave it unopened, and I'll get someone to help me take it to the office tomorrow." Normally, this would be a rational explanation, except for 3 things. 1. The complete silence on the other end of the phone for a few seconds after I first told her about the box, long enough for me to almost ask, "Are you still there?" since Laura is never at a loss for words. 2. The way she told me not to open it. It was more of an order than a request, and you could clearly hear the tension in her voice when she said it. Having worked in anti-terrorism for several years, I, by osmosis, recognized the importance of stress and nuance. 3. Her entire demeanor, not just the command not to open the box, was tense. My curiosity was piqued enough that I took some photos of the box and entered the return address information into my laptop. The 4th thing that made me anxious happened as soon as Laura returned from work. After saying hello only carelessly, she ran over to the box, examined it. Obviously, she was checking to see if I had messed it up, and then was very vague and aloof when I asked her what was in it. "I'm not sure exactly, but I was expecting to see some artwork from an organization in Chicago that wanted to set up an exhibit at my school. I'll open it and look at it at work." "Would you like me to help and open it now?" I asked, not only to be a nice guy, but to test her reaction. "Oh, no. We need to, take a look at it at work to make sure there's no damage in case there's an insurance claim." The usually perky Laura stammered. The next morning, before I had even left for work, 2 guys from the college where she worked showed up and carefully moved the box into the school van under Laura's careful supervision. When I said, "I can't wait to see the exhibition at school, when will you have everything ready?" It wasn't because I was really interested in seeing the exhibit. It was to test Laura's reaction. Without making eye contact, she replied, I'm not sure exactly, but, of course I will. I'll let you know. If we decide about the exhibit." 2 stutters in less than 14 hours on the same topic from the usually fluent Laura. If that didn't pique my interest, nothing would. The 5th thing that pissed me off and made me suspicious was that Laura never said anything more about the mystery box. In the 2 weeks following the arrival of the mystery package, I learned most of what was publicly available about Romano's photo studios. It was a business in the United States of world-renowned photographer Piero Romano, a man I had probably heard of at some point, but surprisingly, a man I'm sure Laura had never mentioned, even though it was part of her hobby of photography and her work at university. She often talked about artists and photographers. Piero had a very distinctive style. Most of his photographs were characterized by both true photographic realism in some parts and effects in other parts. He was considered a master of the traditional photographic effects of bokeh, blur, panning, rule of thirds, and long exposures, often combining several effects in a single photograph. He was also the sole practitioner of a unique effect named in his honor, Romano's artistic ability, which I understand loosely translates to Romano's artistry, but I've never seen it spelled out in English, that no one else has been able to replicate and is difficult to describe in English. My best attempt would be to say that it makes some objects super realistic, while neighboring objects are fuzzy, and with changes in color, if the photo is in color, or hue within the same object, but that description falls short. While most of the information about Piero was intellectually and artistically interesting, two facts struck me. The person in charge of administration at his studio was his niece, Gina Romano Bianchi. I knew Laura's friend, whom I had met only once and never in Chicago. Her married name is Gina Bianchi. He died in a car accident last September 1st, and his memorial service in Chicago, before his body was shipped to his ancestral burial site in Italy, was on September 6th. What a coincidence that around September 2nd, Laura cried, presumably because she was getting lonely and that Laura and the girls were on their shopping trip to Chicago from September 5th. 8. Although I'm not a rocket scientist, I'm smart enough to have a master's degree in chemistry from one of the top 10 schools in the country, so I was able to figure it out. Despite how crushing it was to me, the only logical explanation was that Laura had had a real love affair with Piero Romano for at least 10 years, and that my daughters knew all about it. Another interesting fact. On April 16th, 3 weeks after I learned this information, there was to be an exhibition in Chicago of Piero's most famous and inspiring works, including those owned by private collectors, some of which had never been on public display before. I was sure that Laura would have a business trip to Chicago around this time, even though it was my birthday on the 18th, and the exhibition would likely include the photographs that had been in the box delivered to our home 2 weeks earlier. Never in my life have I been more motivated to come up with a plan to deal with my whore wife and traitor daughters. Because of my initial anger that I would have to suppress to accomplish what I wanted, I had to arrange a business trip for the night of the day I learned the compromising information, and 2 nights later. I apologized fervently to Laura in a message I left on her work phone after I had packed everything I needed from our home for a 3-night stay at a local hotel, promising to make it up to her. The first part of my plan was to prepare all the necessary divorce papers for filing as soon as I had the proof I expected. The second part was to find a way to get someone to attend the Chicago exposition and videotape it on the first day it opened, the 16th, which was by invitation only. The third part was to do everything I could to come out of my divorce with as much wealth and money as possible. I no longer cared about my relationship with Laura and was very close to having the same feelings for Grace and Angela. Part 4 was the ultimate revenge, including after the divorce was final. There was no problem with the first part. I got a recommendation from a good divorce attorney, Gail Schiff. She advised me on everything I needed to do, and although she recommended that the grounds be irreconcilable differences, she was willing to accept long-standing adultery. Gail just needed some evidence before she could file the papers, which I expected she would have on the morning of the 17th. And she could arrange for Laura to be served by a law enforcement agent other than the county sheriff and with a private process server to record the events on the last night of the show on the 18th. For the second part, I gathered as much information as I could about art appraisers with any connection to Chicago. I found a young appraiser named Roberto Milan who was trying to build his business. I actually went to see him in Chicago and talked to him for almost an entire day. Roberto was generally familiar with Piero's work and was confident that he could get an invitation to the opening on the 16th. He didn't mind shooting what I thought might be of interest, using the small, expensive, easily concealed HD camera I had given him, and he thought he could give a good and high estimate of what the photos I expected to be there were worth. Some really experienced appraiser might be able to refute my analysis, but I would be happy to accept the challenge as it would help me establish myself as a real player in the art appraisal world, were the final words that led me to hire Roberto. For the segment of parts 3 and 4, I cashed in 2 bearer bonds that had been held in our safe deposit box for at least 12 years. I couldn't remember if Laura had ever really known about them, and she certainly wouldn't remember them now. They were now worth about $25,000 together. For another piece of Part 3, I provided my attorney with a complete list of all our assets, including an appraisal of our house. I photographed all of Laura's jewelry and the entire contents of our safe deposit box, minus the bearer bonds, of course, and provided my attorney with updated bank statements, credit card numbers, and unpaid purchases, retirement and brokerage accounts. As a little snippet of Part 4, on the last day I was supposedly out of town, I snuck into the house while Laura was at work and magically erased my face from every photo in the dozen or so scrapbooks Laura had made over the years with a magic marker. Having never looked through them in their entirety before, I was surprised at the low percentage of photos I was in, no more than 15%. I also found 2 photos that I had never seen before, and even if I had, I probably would have considered them innocent. They were of Laura, Gina, Grace, Angela, and, drumroll, Piero. These photos I scanned and made high-quality photocopies before returning them to the album, crossing them out with a black marker, indicating Piero with an arrow and signing them, "The love of Laura's life." Laura told me 2 days after I returned from my business trip that she needed to travel to Chicago from the morning of the 15th to noon on the 19th. When I expressed disappointment that she would not be with me for my birthday party and offered to keep her company, she calmly, obviously she was counting on my reaction, objected, saying it was business, but that she would take me to the resort the following weekend and make it up to me in a way I had never experienced before. She accompanied that statement with a passionate kiss. As for all parts 1, 3I, and 4, that was a particularly risky part of my plan. The rest, especially after I got comfortable with the art appraiser and hired him, I was pretty sure would fall into place. The risky part was talking to Grace. I decided I needed to meet Grace face-to-face, so as soon as I dropped Laura off at the airport on the morning of the 15th, I drove about 250 kilometers from Columbus to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where Grace was studying chemical engineering. Why Grace and not Angela? Although both girls were much more in tune with their mother than with me, Grace was much more like me, at least as far as how her brain worked, than Angela. Neither Angela nor Laura could ever have envisioned a course of study in chemical engineering, certainly very close to my chemistry degrees. Grace also had a harder time lying than Angela or Laura, and although her refusal to tell me about Laura's love affair with Piero indicated otherwise, or maybe not, she was more concerned about family than Angela. I called Grace's cell phone when I was about halfway there. She really seemed excited about the meeting. I told her I would take her out for a late lunch at a real restaurant. We met at a restaurant of her choice, about a kilometer away from campus, and took a secluded table. After we ate, I said, "I need to talk to you about something very serious, Grace." A puzzled expression appeared on her face. "Are you okay, Dad?" Physically, yes, but emotionally, despite the obvious lack of outward manifestations, I'm a wreck. Before I talk to you, though, I want you to promise me that you won't tell anyone about this, including your mom and Angela, until the day after my birthday. Promise? I said, raising my hand in the swear position after asking, "Promise?" "Wow, that sounds serious," she gulped. "Okay, Daddy, I promise, I swear," she said, raising her hand and trying to squeeze out a smile. "I found out about your mother's affair with Piero Romano, and I'm trying to decide whether to divorce her," I blurted out. "Oh no, Daddy," she exclaimed, pressing her hand to her mouth, tears welling up in her eyes. "There's only one hope. I need to find out everything you know about this, and I need you to do a DNA test." "What?" she exclaimed before she was on the verge of a complete breakdown. I realized that the restaurant wasn't the right place for this. I told her to meet me outside, and after I paid the bill, we would walk to my car. I tracked down the waitress, paid cash, leaving a $1.20 tip, and found Grace, still in tears, on the sidewalk. As soon as we got into my car, I said, "Okay, Grace, spill it. Our family's continued existence depends on it." After a few minutes of sobbing, during which she couldn't get anything out of herself and I just stared at her, she began to speak. I didn't realize that my mother was sleeping with Piero, or Uncle Piero, as we were told to call him, until I was 12. Despite the displays of affection every time we were in Chicago, especially at Christmas. I know this from Angela's comments that she made that she knew before, but I wasn't sophisticated enough to realize it. I talked to my mom. She said it was mature, that she was in love with two men, and that I would understand when I grew up. That you must never find out because it could mean the end of our family because you were too insensitive. I think that was the word she used to characterize you. So I was sworn to secrecy. Grace was silent again for a moment and then continued. I hoped that Piero's funeral would be the end of it, and that you would never find out. After she made a fool of herself at his coffin, I confronted her again. I told her that if she had just jumped into the arms of someone else, I would have told you the whole story. She slapped me and asked me how I could think of her as a whore, that she loved Piero and she loved you and there would be no one else. She just had to honor Piero's memory. I believed her and prayed that this day, when you find out, would never come, because I'm sure she wouldn't have another love or even a sexual affair. I pestered her for more information until I decided it would be counterproductive to get more. She was, as I had hoped, still in a state of mental anguish when I distressed her with the second reason for my visit. I'm hoping to build a relationship with your mother, Grace, and what you've told me will help. However, I need something else. I need us to submit DNA samples to make sure you're my biological daughter. No, Daddy, no, she screamed. You're my only father. I know I am your father, I replied, but I need to know if I am your biological father, too. Let me wet your cheek. I'll wet mine, and we'll put them in this envelope, I said, pulling a large envelope from the back seat. And together we'll send it to the testing lab. She protested some more, but finally agreed. I blotted her cheek. Then I blotted mine. I pretended to drop the sealed tampon on the floor of the car, then pulled another from under the seat to take its place. She never noticed. I showed her a letter in an envelope addressed to the lab. She saw 2 swab containers in the envelope, and then I sealed it. The instructions in the letter were to send the results both directly to Grace and to me. As I drove her back to campus, she watched me drop the envelope into the express mailbox on the way. As we hugged goodbye, she pleaded, Promise me that you'll forgive your mom and you'll make it work. I can't promise now because I don't lie like she did. However, you have done your part to increase the chances that it will work. Now remember, don't tell anyone about our conversation until the 19th at the earliest. I promised, she smiled. Then she hesitated. There's, one more thing. I have to tell you, Mom and Angela will be at the Chicago exhibit of Pierrot's work, some of which are pictures of Mom on your birthday. She told me that she was sorry about the way things turned out, but she has to attend because the works she inherited from Piero in his will be on display. She wanted me to come too, but I had too much schoolwork to do. I smiled, and as nonchalantly as I could, I replied, I know. Thank you for your honesty. We hugged again, and she walked away. She didn't see the tears I was shedding, knowing that my relationship with Angela was now as dead as it was with Laura, but not yet deciding if I could save her and Grace. Grace didn't know that I had recorded our conversation in the car. There was one thing Grace didn't know, one that would hurt her and was part 4th of my plan. The tampon I put in the envelope that supposedly belonged to me belonged to an Italian-born janitor who worked in my office building and with whom I had been friends for years. I promised to pay to determine his family tree as a birthday present to him. He didn't even ask why I needed 3 swabs instead of 1 to do it. The one I sent to test his heritage showed that he was over 80% Italian, with a small inclusion of Eastern and Western European blood, which made him happy. Why did I put the Italian's DNA in what was to be tested instead of my own? Because I wanted everyone to be hurt. The reason I used the Italian is because during DNA testing they can, even when comparing 2 sets, figure out the origins of both authors. And since Piero was Italian, I wanted everyone to conclude that he was Grace's father and, if I could figure it out, Angela's. I crossed my fingers that Grace wouldn't tell. I'd spoken to her on the phone on the 16th and 18th, and she'd promised me she hadn't. And since I hadn't heard anything from Laura, I was sure it was true. Around 11 p.m. on the 16th, Roberto Milan emailed me photos of the relevant parts of Romano's exhibit. They hit me deeper than I thought they would. I shook like an aspen leaf and sobbed as I looked through them. They were a collage or series of 10 photographs, increasing in size from the first to the last. They all had the hallmarks of Romano, including in the last two the stunning effects of Romano's artistry. The series was called Natale Amore, Christmas Love. What initially broke my heart was the first two episodes, which featured two girls in front of a picture of a woman who was undoubtedly Laura. While the girls' faces were in bokeh, blur, it was now safe to tell from their hairstyles what they were wearing, Christmas gifts from my mom, and relative sizes that they were Angela and Grace when they were about 9 and 11. In the second picture of the first two, one of Laura's breasts was exposed, and she had a look that could only be described as "fuck me." In the next 3 series, Laura wore less and less clothing until in the last one she was naked and clearly playing with herself, although you couldn't see her hand touching her pussy. The second episode began again with a picture of the girls in the background, this time somewhat older, with the last 4 being increasingly risque until the penultimate one, which showed Laura in an exceptionally sexy frontal nude pose, and the last one where it was clearly implied that she had just been fucked and was in post-coital bliss. After throwing up, drinking some ginger ale, and having a good cry, I looked at the pictures again. If they weren't tearing my heart out, I'd have to say that the last 2 photos were probably the best of their kind I'd ever seen. I read the text accompanying Roberto Milan's report. "I apologize. I know this is going to be hard for you. The collection is worth at least $300,000, more likely $500,000. The penultimate photograph alone would bring $125,000, $175,000 if sold separately. The last 2 photos are the best execution of the artistry of Romano effects in history. Not only in my opinion, but in the opinion of at least 4 other appraisers and art historians whose conversations I overheard. I asked Gina if there was anything for sale. She put me in touch with the owner under Piero's will, not surprisingly, Laura. Laura said they were not currently for sale because they were priceless, and that the 4 photos in which she is completely nude would not be sold until after her death. "I wouldn't want the general public, and especially my husband, to see me like this while I'm alive," she said. "Especially my husband," with a laugh. Even though he was doing his job, he might as well have ripped my balls off. "I have it on tape," were the last words of his email, accompanied by a frowning smiley face. I emailed a digital form of my recording of what Grace had said, along with photos and Roberto's words, to my attorney, Gail Schiff. She called me at 7:30 a.m. on the morning of the 17th. "Apparently your petition for divorce is based on an allegation of adultery. A law enforcement officer will be serving Laura tomorrow night at the reception." "I have something to add," I said. "I'll send this so you can send it to your process server along with the divorce papers." I handed Gail an envelope addressed to Angela. The envelope contained a letter from me, a swab from the Italian janitor's cheek, a container of new swabs, and an express mail envelope addressed to the DNA lab with instructions attached. The letter from me to Angela read, "Angela, if there is any hope of you and I having a relationship in the future, there is one thing you must do for me. You need to swab the inside of my cheek, put it in an envelope addressed to the DNA lab that already has my swab in it, and send the envelope by express mail. As you can see, the lab has instructions to send the results directly to you at school as well as to me. Maybe you don't want a relationship with me in the future. However, you still need to do as I ask, because if you don't, I'll make sure my money is tied up in it, and you can say goodbye to tuition, room and board, and end of freshman and senior year expenses at that expensive private college you're attending. So even if you hate me as much as your actions and inactions toward me in the past would suggest, it's in your best interest to do what I ask. Grace has already complied with the request. Your father, Grant Oster." And I was glad I wasn't there when the scandal broke in Chicago on my birthday. The process server told Gail that Laura and Angela were smiling broadly as they interacted with the public around 9 p.m. on the 18th. They were puzzled when the law enforcement officer handed them envelopes, as the process server who was with him was taking pictures. They opened the envelopes on the spot. The law enforcement officer left, but the processing server stayed, taking more photos until he was kicked out. The photos he emailed to Gail and Gail emailed to me showed Laura sinking lower and lower to the ground, finally landing in a fetal position, and Angela first distraught, then angry. She tried to tend to her prostrate mother. "Really ruined the holiday," was the treatment server's final cryptic comment in the email that accompanied the photos, with a smiling emoji attached. Angela called me on the morning of the 19th, expressing her disgust at the way I'd filed this with the papers. To which I replied, "Tough bitch traitor. Tell that to someone who cares." Those were words I'd never spoken to her before in my life. She said, "I'm not inclined to do the DNA thing." "Don't you want to find out who your biological father is, instead of the chump who's been supporting you all these years?" I asked sarcastically. "You're my father," she replied. "Maybe, maybe not," I replied. "One thing is for sure, though. I've already asked my lawyer to freeze all of your mother's accounts and mine. I can assure you that there will be no money in the future for your education or even living expenses, since you've turned 20, unless you mail this envelope with your tampon. Now that I think about it, I'm going to need a videotape of you wiping your cheek with your tampon, putting it in an envelope and mailing it, all at the same time to believe you, given the lies you've told me over the years." "That's cruel. I didn't lie to you," she growled. "Oh, really?" I chuckled. "But you didn't tell the whole truth, did you? Your sister is remorseful and will get her tuition paid. Obviously, you're as nasty a bitch as your mother, so I'm not going to waste my time discussing this with you. Because you make me sick. Either do as I say and email me the video, or this is the last conversation we'll ever have in your life." With those words, I threw the phone down. It's nice to have a landline where you can make a statement by hanging up, rather than just pressing that red button, which had no accent, on a cell phone. The nasty mother bitch made no attempt to call me on the 18-21 set, and probably postponed her return to Columbus for 2 days, feeling sorry for her crony Gina. The excitement at the show on the 18th was noted not only in the 2 major Chicago newspapers, but also in 2 national art publications. In each appeared a photo of Laura lying down, obviously sold to them by a process server. I laughed heartily in between urges to empty the contents of my stomach. Apparently, the nasty bitch had indeed come to the house, which, as far as I could tell, was no longer a house, on the 22nd. I only know because the envelope I left on the new front door, steel with a reinforced frame and replaced lock, just like the side and back doors, was no longer there, and my lawyer left a message on my cell phone that we needed to talk. The envelope was addressed to "nasty fucking whore," and I assumed Laura must have known it was her. My internal message was brief. "Hey, bitch, have your lawyer contact mine to see when you can get your personal belongings. The sooner we sell the house and end our sham marriage, the better. I will fight every attempt you make to get back into this house until it is sold. Do something worthy for the first time in our farcical relationship. Don't fight it. Not that you would fight it for any other reason than economic, since you have no love or respect for me. Your former ignoramus Grant. P.S. The doors are padlocked. Any unauthorized entry will result in the destruction of all your previous family albums." The attorneys needed to appear in court to decide something about the living arrangements. I probably could have gotten exactly what I wanted if I hadn't written that P.S. in a note to the whore, but I couldn't help myself. Eventually we, through our lawyers, agreed to vacate the house and put it up for sale immediately. In doing so, the amount of our temporary housing expenses would be factored into the division of the estate. Laura tried to be difficult in negotiating money, but she had no bargaining power because she had purchased her precious photographs from Piero when we were still married. When I demanded 5 photos, she could choose 1, then me, etc., until all 10 were shared. According to her attorney, she became hysterical, especially since by then she had seen how I had retouched the family photo albums. At Laura's insistence, we had Romano's photos evaluated, one by an appraiser she hired and one by a neutral appraiser. The funny thing is that Romano's photo was the lowest and cost her $200,000 more than if she had agreed with his appraisal. Since this had a serious impact on what she would end up getting, she offered me 2 photos, the ones she chose herself. However, she rescinded that offer when I asked my attorney to tell her that I would agree on the condition that she take them to a local landfill and observe what I would do with them. When all was said and done, by the time the divorce proceedings were finalized, Laura was left with her personal belongings, including all of her scrapbooks. She was angry that I didn't want any of them. Half of her furniture and a quarter of the sale price of the house. Nothing else, including no child support but suspended jail time. More on that later. We did agree to share all of Grace and Angela's college expenses until they graduated, but no more than that. As for Angela and Grace, as expected, the DNA results showed that they were not my biological daughters. This infuriated Laura so much that she almost had a stroke. I talked about it with Grace, not Angela, who honored my request solely to pay for her college expenses and was apparently content to have no further relationship with me. Dad, Mom says the results are wrong. She said that while she was married to you, she never had sex with anyone but you and Piero, and that she never even met Piero before I was born. Then why is your father of Italian descent like Piero, while I am Dutch on both sides of my family? Your mother has demonstrated that she is a pathological liar, lied to me about loving me for the entire 24-plus years of our relationship. So why should you believe anything she says is true? She says she wants another DNA test. That's not going to happen because you are not minor children and it has nothing to do with the divorce. I just wanted to know for myself and for you and Angela to know the truth. Besides, you saw me blot my cheek and put the tampon in the envelope and then mail it myself. Dad, Mom wants to talk to you in person too. She says she's made several requests through her lawyer, but she's not even sure if your lawyer got the message to you, because she never got an answer. She never got a response because I told my attorney to ignore her request. What reason would I have to talk to that whore? Dad, please don't call her that in front of me. I still love her despite her flaws. I'm asking you to please do me a favor. Talk to her for an hour, please. I'm sorry, Grace, I can't help it. I've forgiven you and I'd like to maintain a relationship with you, but there's nothing, and I mean nothing, that would make me want to talk to her. Now about Laura's suspended jail sentence and receiving only a quarter of the proceeds from the sale of the house. After my phone conversation with Grace about the DNA test and Laura's desire to talk to me, she did something stupid. I thought she might pull something, so I plugged in and walked around with a panic button connected directly to a private security company. One night, a woman knocked on the door of the apartment I was renting during the divorce proceedings until the final financial details were worked out. I didn't see the two big men and Laura standing off to the side when I looked through the peephole. As soon as I opened the door, two big guys burst in and grabbed me, but not before I hit my silent panic button. As soon as they grabbed me, they jerked me into a chair and tied me to it while Laura walked in and the other woman left. Grant, I'm sorry I had to do this, but you refused to meet with me and refused to repeat the DNA test, which we both know is wrong. Then she started spouting some hilarious nonsense about how she had always loved me and that she just loved Piero on top of that. That her heart was big enough for both of us. She realized that we were past the point of reconciliation, but just wanted to lighten her soul. Talking to me, she held a tampon in her hands. Apparently, she was going to forcefully take a DNA sample from me. She was really annoyed that I didn't verbally respond in any way to anything she was saying. I refused to even acknowledge her presence, trying my best to avoid eye contact. Fortunately, just as she was about to order her two goons to open my mouth for a DNA swab, my panic button went off. The security company called the police and 3 cops, with guns at the ready, burst into the house. They found me tied up and one of the rogue cops had an illegal weapon in his pants pocket. I explained the situation as the cops held the 3 of them at gunpoint. The cops ignored Laura's request to just let them go. They didn't want to hurt me. They arrested the 3 of them. A minor assault didn't please the judge in our divorce proceedings. After she made it clear that if she had to rule, it would be really bad for Laura, I got the division of property and other considerations outlined above. The criminal court took pity on Laura as this was her first offense. She got 2 years probation and a $10,000 fine, which was only from her share of the marital estate. The 2 boys didn't do so well because they had dark histories. One got a year in jail before parole would be possible, and the one with the illegal weapon got 5 years before parole would be possible. The fourth part of my plan didn't end when the divorce became final, although I don't admit here or anywhere else that I had anything to do with it. Just karma is what I always answer when asked about it. 18 months after my divorce was finalized, I was on a Caribbean cruise with a 32-year-old hot little divorcee who loved to be treated right and rich, and loved sex even more. She was too much like Laura at that age and had too much of a temper for me to seek a permanent relationship with her. But she was fun to be with, even though she wore me out fucking. While I was on the cruise, Laura's apartment was broken into while she was at work. The apartment was trashed. Some things were stolen, including the second most provocative and valuable photograph of Laura Romano. She had loaned the most valuable and provocative one to an art gallery for an extended period of time, so it wasn't in her apartment. However, more items were destroyed than stolen, including 7 of Romano's 8 remaining photographs and all the family photo albums, all but the 2 earliest. Of course, I was a suspect when I returned. Obviously, I couldn't have done it myself since I was on a cruise 3,000 kilometers away, but Laura insisted to the cops that I had paid someone to do it. When the cops approached me, and once they started asking questions indicating I was a suspect, I refused to talk to them and hired a criminal defense attorney. After searching my phone and financial records, which certainly did not include 2 cashed-in bearer bonds that were never part of the divorce estate, they could find no indication that I could have paid anyone to do this, and there was no connection they could find to anyone who was capable of doing so. To do what had been done. I got the distinct impression that 6 months after their initial contact with me, the cops had pretty much given up, though I'm sure Laura continued to harass them. As soon as the statute of limitations expired, I threw a party. My "It's Finally Over" party was attended mostly by friends. My parents were no longer alive, but my brother, his wife, my 2 nephews, my new love interest Melody, a widow my age, Melody and Grace's 2 grown children, her husband, and my granddaughter were there. I had no relationship with Angela then, and have none now. I was not invited to her wedding, and would not have gone even if invited. However, I have heard from Grace that Angela's husband caught her cheating, and she is in the early stages of divorce proceedings. Laura gave Grace an ultimatum: either cut all ties with me or her. To everyone's surprise, including mine, she chose me, probably because she was convinced that Laura, as I had envisioned her, was a pathological liar. More importantly, Grace realized how horrible it was that her mother had thrown information about her relationship with her lover in her daughter's face and made them lie to cover up her infidelity. Grace didn't want her children to face that attitude. Only one thing had caused friction between Grace and me over the past 5 years. I told her the truth about the DNA testing. She was angry with me at first, but she forgave me, just as I had forgiven her for her duplicity over the years. She was actually very happy that I was her biological father. I had another DNA test done to prove it, in addition to the practical one. I do believe Laura moved to Chicago, but I don't know for sure, and more importantly, I don't give a shit.